Yeah, let's do it. All right. Jackie, do you want to just kick us off here?
Sure.
Officially.
Right. Thank you all for joining us. This is our third meeting on the middle housing concepts from the Housing Options Study and Action Plan that we're working on as kind of this first batch of implementation strategies. I think as we've corresponded with you, thank you for being flexible on our change of schedule dates. So this is meeting number 3, and we'll have meeting number, oh, wow, Elizabeth, you're good. And we'll have meeting number 4 here on February 22nd. And just a little, update, these slides have just been posted to the project page as well for today's date, if anyone needs to pull them up at their leisure. So I will, did you want me to go through this part, Elizabeth, or?
Sure, you want to just
Okay.
keep it
So
situated in context here.
that's right. So we've got the next step after we conclude the technical group here is for the staff, the project staff, to take all that we've heard and draft a public amendment proposal for public review, and that's that open house and number 2 there, you see that. So more information on coming on that. We're still kind of finalizing a date, so once we have that totally confirmed, we will of course communicate that out. And then the next batch of strategies specifically related to the multifamily and regulated affordable housing strategies will get started in the spring, and we'll get those dates out to those that wanted to participate, as well as the ones we're going to send it out to all of you all that are part of the technical group. So if you're interested in attending those, so more communication to come on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Elizabeth Decker again, and here to talk some more about code. So for today, I think that we wanted to spend the bulk of our day talking through the draft code. You'll see that the proposed amendments are primarily to the residential zones, the low and medium density zones, and then, some parking standards just for fun. And that, just to keep in mind, this is the first part of the code. There's another batch of code updates that we'll be bringing you at our 4th meeting for your review. And it's just that the idea here is, by setting some of the base standards, that will help inform our discussion on some of those others. So that's why we've got the mix or the chapters that we selected for today. That's the rationale. We're hoping to go through those. And before we get into the details, just, one more sort of look, big picture, before we zoom down into the details, is just a reminder again of what we're trying to do with these code updates. Right, that with middle housing and these smaller single family, we've got 5 broader housing objectives in the housing options plan, but at least 3 of them are probably the most relevant, right? Looking at housing for middle income households, how to expand that supply, looking for a diversity of housing types and tenure, so both rental and ownership properties, and then increasing the range of housing sizes that are available, particularly as we see more smaller households. So just to keep in mind, there is no one project that we have in mind that these standards are being written for, because no one project can meet all of these needs, all of these objectives, or all of the housing needs of Clark County. So when we're evaluating those, just, for us to all be keeping in mind, how does this fit within the objectives? How does this create multiple pathways? Even if it's not an opportunity we have today, even if it's not something we've seen on the market, could there be room for something new that could better meet these objectives, in addition to the options that we have that being built in our community today? All right. So I used a little bit of color coding from the zoning map. I don't know, I figure some of you know, but the residential zones are generally yellow, and then increase in up to orange for multifamily or higher densities, and then red's normally commercial. There's a whole secret code So if you don't know it today, you've learned it. So we'll use some yellow here to kick off our low density residential zone discussion, which coincidentally is the proposed new name for the R1 districts. And so right now they're, just to set our terminology before we dive in, right now they're called the single family residential districts, all of the R120 through R15. And given the diversity of housing types that we're proposing with this project, we felt that single family wasn't really an appropriate name. So we proposed the ever creative low density residential as a better way to capture the purpose of this zone. The individual names of the zones, the R1, 10, 20, as we discussed before, there's no changes proposed to those. And all of these zones implement the comprehensive plan designation of urban low. And so we propose to have a similar purpose statement for all 5 of the zones. Right now they're separated into 2 categories. One being more about protecting existing density and one allowing a greater range of housing. And now that we're proposing a range of housing across all 5 zones, that appeared to be more consistent also, since they still all implement the same comp plan designation. And you can see really clearly from this use table why there's a more unified purpose across these zones. Because one of the broad aims of this project through this round of code updates is really expanding the range of both single family as well as introducing these middle housing types into across these new low density zones. Well, same zones, new name, newly christened LDR zones. So we're looking here, some of the notable changes, single family detached accessory dwellings already permitted, no changes there, but looking to make duplexes permitted on all lots, not just restricted to corner lots in a few of the existing zones. Proposing to introduce triplexes and quadplexes in all of these zones. Moving townhouses, right now they're technically permitted in all these zones, but only through a PUD. So moving to permit them outright. And one sort of structural change that you'll see carried through these is we've talked a lot about compact subdivisions and thinking about how those regulations are going to get implemented within the structure of the code. The proposal is to essentially treat them as a different use category, similar to cottage housing. And so we're adding them to the use table here. There will be additional standards, as we'll talk about in the second package. But just as we've discussed, allowing these smaller scale, but higher number of units, more analogous to cottage housing. That use is being proposed in all of the zones, and then cottage housing is being proposed to expand into the R120 and R110 zones. And so another sort of technical change is there's a review and approval category of uses right now in the zone table. It's a little bit of an administrative issue that it points to one set of standards that then just point back to the special use standards for each of these different types of uses. And so we're proposing, for clarity's sake, to change these in the use table to a permitted use, still subject to exactly the same special use standards that they are now, but a little bit more of a direct code cross-reference rather than a roundabout tour of the code. So the way that I thought, because there's so many details and so many tables, that would go topic by topic and have a little chance to discuss in between while these concepts are fresh in our mind. So on these uses in the R1 zones, first chance here for some feedback, thinking about any refinements to the uses and the zones that permitted. They're pretty similar across all the zones as proposed. And so does that seem right to use the scale of these developments rather than the types of the dwellings to distinguish between those zones? A related question there could be, would a standard on the maximum number of attached townhouses that could be differentiated by zone, could that be useful to help scale these uses across zones? And then a use that you didn't see on that featured use table is about the 0 lot line developments. They're currently permitted in several of the districts. we didn't hear a lot about them. They didn't come up in the code audit, but I certainly noticed them as part of this code work and thought, I wonder if this is also something we should expand, or if it's not really being used, we could just, leave this off of our list because it wasn't on our initial strategies list. So looking forward to feedback on these uses. Oh, and let me see, I can't see hands very well the way that my screen is displayed, so please just jump in.
Okay, I'll start off then. So we can start with the last one there, the zero lot line developments. Currently, we're not doing them just because there's not a great incentive to do them, and they're difficult. I had seen some of this stuff in like Minneapolis, where it was really a keyhole. It was where the one lot may be wide in the front and narrow in the back, and the neighboring lot would be narrow in the front and wide in the back. And you would put it to where your house was on the one side of it was on the lot line, so that you had basically a side yard and a backyard, and the other one would have, so the basic back and forth, you would alternate back and forth. So that's really where the zero lot line developments are at. They're currently permitted. We don't use them. I think it's because they're so difficult to meet the width requirement of the current lot. So maybe there's a way of rewriting that if you do a zero lot line, this keyhole concept, to be able to make it to where you have a much smaller footprint overall, but you end up having the private yard areas that people like. So I don't know what kind of code you could write that up with. That's the concept of a zero lot line development. In that they call them, back in Minneapolis, they were calling them key lots, so where they one fit with the opposite with the other one.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good clue.
Some of the different things that I looked at with your refinements in your tables is that you need to reduce the lot width and depth, since those have not been reduced. And you get to a smaller lot, you can certainly go to a smaller width and length. I mean, we've got a 20-foot wide detached house that's 56 feet long, 1,750 square feet, lays out great. But if you are stuck with a 40-foot minimum lot width, you're never going to build it. But I can certainly we've developed stuff for 30-foot wide lots. And I'm sure that I've got a townhouse that I've built at 18 feet wide, 3 stories tall. That would be also a fine detached house. So I can go down 28-foot wide and still make something that's very usable. And on the height, 35 feet, when you start getting into a 3-story building, which, if you go to a real narrow lot, if you just had the bottom story being a garage area, you certainly want something. It's advisable to try and keep those garages a little bit taller. And then with us going to more and more conditioned airspace, we're running ducting through in between each of the floors. So we're going to, 2 inches wider on our flanges, and the depth of the floor in between. So I propose that you look at the maximum height. If what it says 35, I would say go to 38.
Right.
Let's see here. You've got a bunch of stuff in there that says it's 10 foot between buildings, especially if you do a zero lot line. 8 foot is all that's required from the fire department. And in other parts of the code, you would go to you can go to 8 foot between residential. So probably need to make it consistent and go to 8 foot. Of course, if you get between less than 8 foot, or when you get to 8 foot, there's fire code that's related to the building permit, so a builder will know about that. Let's see here. And then the other thing was if you go to a narrower lot, with these townhouses, stuff like that, when you start getting into then you fall into the narrow lot standards. And when you get down to like 18 feet, I've seen a couple of developments at 18 feet. And when you're required at a narrow lot to be able to put a tree in the front, by the time you get a single family or a single car garage and driveway to it and a walkway to the porch, there's no room left for trees. So it may be to where we have to work on that narrow lot development. I think it's 40.
260, 155.
Yep. So there'll probably be some things that need to be looked at in there. I was thinking that one of the things that we could do is that you probably look at is that instead of requiring trees in the front of every single lot, maybe what you do is you make it to where it's the number of trees should be planted on, one lot, one tree per lot, and make it over average over the whole subdivision. So you could put, more street trees on different lots or street trees in the backs and get rid of the front, because once you get smaller and smaller lot width, it's going to become more and more difficult. So.
Sure. And not to cut you off, but we are going to sort of talk through some of the other concepts in code. And so we're starting in the use table. All of it is related, but if there's any other things specific to the uses in each zone, would love to start there.
I guess the other thing that I've got is that there's ADUs. We've got ADUs in those tables, and then and duplexes are permitted now. The ADU is limited to 8 to 40% of the other structure that's in there. We should probably look at making modifications there, because the only difference between ADU, if you could do a duplex, then you do a duplex. It could be both sides can be either side. If you're doing an ADU and it's only limited to 40%, if it goes to 50 or 60%, it's just a bigger ADU, but you just would allow it because of a duplex. The only difference would be is some of the permitting costs.
Yeah, no, and we'll definitely get into that with the special standards for ADUs in 40 to 60 next month. I think that's been flagged in our concept.
Okay.
Yeah, just take another look at that 40%. We'll talk about, what distinctions are going to remain between duplexes and ADUs. Permitting is one of them. The other is some of the SDCs right now are significantly lower for ADUs. So it could still be a role for those.
Okay.
But point taken that, 40% makes a lot less sense as a limitation. All right. I can see a couple hands right now. Eric, how about you?
Yeah, on like what's allowed in each use, not that I don't think we should ask for it, because we probably should, but I think there's gonna be a lot of pushback in the R10 and our R110, R120 zones. I don't know if anyone's watched like a hearing for a cottage project, but they are typically not very well received by the neighborhood. I think county staff who's worked on them could probably, attest to that. They typically do not want that higher density next to them. When you get into the R110, R120, and you're putting those smaller lots, I think you're going to get a lot of pushback. And the council as well, I have a feeling they may not support it. So the question is, when we ask for it, is the baby going to get thrown out with the bathwater, or will they say, you know what, maybe it's appropriate in R17 to R15, but not R110, R120, where if we propose it in just R15 to R17, we may lose it there as well. So I think there's some strategy here, and I think we need to be aware that there's going to be some pushback, and that not everyone in the community is, crazy about that density and that type of product next to them. If you ask about it in general, they're fine with it. Put it next to them, you're going to get a NIMBY thing, and they're not going to like it. So just from experience, every time we've done a cottage project, pretty contentious. So. Yeah,
no, and I think that, we've heard sort of different things, and I know that this group is well aware of some of those tensions that, does it make sense to ask for a lot, knowing that some things are going to get taken out and that it represents our best faith effort, or is there some, compromise that, yeah, appears more rational, reasonable on the surface and is more likely to get a good reception. So yes, well noted. Thank you. And Brian, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I was, but I think I was just gonna respond to some of the things that Daniel had said about kind of like some building height and some lot width stuff. I was just gonna clarify how that stuff's defined, but I don't think it's really relevant because as you kind of reined it in, that we're just talking about the uses right now, so.
Yeah, we're going to get to dimensional standards to a degree. Yeah. But thanks. Yes, there is always nuance. All right, so let's start with moving on to some dimensions here. Talking about the lot area standards. So generally, the way that these are proposed, we've discussed these in concept before. But the idea is that the single family detached is proposed to be reduced somewhere between 10 to 20%, but not so much that it, occupies, that it gets all the way to the lot size of the next lowest zone currently. So like in R16, it's 6,000 square feet. We might have reduced it to 5,000, but that would be the same as R15 right now. So the compromise of 5,500 is proposed. Just to sort of like keep it within some parameters of what it is now and not make it a stealth rezone or a stealth up zone. To the point we were just talking about what's the right approach in R120 and R110. I know we've gone back and forth about, do we propose any reductions in R120? Is that really where we're going to see this middle housing or sort of any increase in housing production that's going to meet our objectives? This is the number that I put out there for consideration, but I have mixed feelings about, just the efficacy of that as a strategy. So certainly open to your feedback on that one. The duplex dwellings, the important aspect of that is to make the lot sizes for duplexes the same as the lot sizes for single family detached. And that just opens up so many more lots that are eligible to add a duplex, rather than by making the lots, even if it's only, 10, well, even if it were only 1,000, just making it that much, but it used to be significantly larger, say 10,000 instead of 6,000 in the R16 zone. Making it that much larger means that the average, that lot has to be specially created for a duplex, and it really reduces the flexibility for a lot to be used for one thing or another, particularly for infill lots. So that's where that comes from. That's what a lot of cities, certainly Oregon is predicated on that idea. I believe some of the work in Minnesota and other places are also moving towards a similar lot size for duplexes. And then for triplexes and quadplexes, that is set. My personal formula for this proposal was to use either the minimum lot size for single family detached or the appropriate unit multiplier of the townhouse size, whichever was larger, to create some parity. So that's where those numbers come from, the proposed sizes. Those, of course, are all new because we don't have those lot sizes or those dwellings yet. And then the townhouses, those are also all new with this proposal. And, again, you see the R120 that at one point we thought about leaving it out. I felt like we had some good discussion last time about some larger format townhouses in the R120. And so came up with sort of a compromise proposal. We'll get into the density a minute later, but the absolute minimum that I came up with for our discussion is this 3,000 square feet, and the density is sort of requiring an average of 4,000 square feet. So curious to get your take on that, if that is still a product that is of interest, and then of course then the broader political context of, does it fit in that zone? And then a couple other things to note about the lot sizes here is right now averaging is only permitted of R16 and R15, and we're proposing to allow that averaging in all of the zones, not for townhouses, but for all the other lot sizes. And that these lot sizes are going to be the primary driver in these R1 zones about the scale and intensity of development rather than maximum density. We've as we, excuse me, as we'll get to shortly, the densities were really written to be the tail that follows the dog, not the tail that wags the dog, if that makes sense, like the, or if I'm bungling that metaphor, but the lot area standards are the more important tool as proposed. So density here, since it goes hand in hand with those lot area, we're not proposing any changes to the minimum density. We heard keep those the same. There's still that flexibility. And then the maximums are based on the proposed minimum lot area for single family detached. So it winds up being, that corresponding 10 to 20% increase. The goal for the density standards for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes is essentially to get density out of the way so that the lot sizes can control those intensities. And there's some, fancy words that I came up with to try to say that same thing in the code, but that is the goal behind it. Because otherwise translating, 4 times these maximum densities for a quadplex and then saying that that's the maximum density really, in my opinion, distorts the density tables, and it makes it look like there's an overall density for a district that is really only going to be achieved on, a single project or two. And then the townhouse maximums, excuse me, I base those analogous to the quadplex densities, just thinking, but with 2 other considerations in mind. The first was to align with the minimum lot sizes that we're proposing for townhouses, except for R120, and also to keep below 22 units per acre gets us into urban, well, that's the urban medium threshold, and we certainly did not want to exceed that. We have talked about how density gets measured, right? Is it based on gross site area? Is it based on net site area? And I believe it's gross site area minus right of way and some other types of easements, but it's sort of a modified net. So one thing that came across in discussion with county staff and reading the code in several different sections, as well as the comments we've heard, is that really having a more comprehensive density methodology about, is it net, is it gross, can it be applied across all zones in a bit more of a uniform fashion with clearer definitions in the code, that, there are some benefits that we could see in these R1 zones. We didn't hear, we'll get into for the medium density zones, we didn't hear some of the concerns we heard in medium density about the current methodology here. So, I don't think it's as critical here, but let's discuss with these minimum lot areas and the densities, does the balance between these 2 sets of standards, appear appropriate for the intensity of development, particularly when we start thinking about those plexes and townhouses. As has already come up, this R120 in particular, does it make sense to continue pushing for some of these? Do these create meaningful development opportunities? These, this larger format townhouse that I thought I heard at our last meeting, I'd welcome some further refinement. And then thinking about that density methodology, that it's essentially in these zones measured as the gross area minus the right of way. Is that a particular concern in these zones, or are there other refinements that would particularly make this more useful? And if we could just put a pin in how it gets measured in the medium density, because I have that flagged for later discussion.
That does make a difference when you're not dealing with right of way. If you have private roads and you can't subtract it out, it makes a huge difference. So aligning private roads with right of way and subtracting out other things makes a huge difference.
So I think the density methodology that you're referring to, Elizabeth, is in the medium density. If you're building apartments, you don't have to subtract out the proposed right of way. So the clarity would be the gross minus existing right of way would be the way that you can get the most density. And the other question you had, I think that in the table around the townhouse lots, I think that in the R110, maybe you ought to have a transition from the 3,000 square foot at the R120 to the 2,000 and R175 and go to 2,500 square foot minimum
Mhm.
lot size for the townhouses. I think that would be more palatable.
Thanks. Other thoughts? Okay, I'm happy to keep going. I thought there would be a lot of comments on that one. But density transfer is sort of the other related density piece here. This is not something that has come up, right, in our discussions to date, which could be insightful in and of itself. We will need to do, some at least minor revisions to the density transfer standards so that they line up with these other changes we're proposing to the minimum lot sizes and density in the zone. But before we get into that and really try to think through, because there's a whole different way that density gets measured for density transfer purposes, we thought we would just use this group as a technical resource to better understand how and when density transfer has come up on projects you've been working on, how useful it is compared to some other options. Right now, the code says that it can't be used in conjunction with a PUD. And so we're just curious, like, is that something we should take a look at? Is there a need for density transfer in addition, as a component of these PUDs and possibly cottage housing and or compact plots? Or do you just sort of, run out of room on the lots to, if you're already increasing the density through those channels, does density transfer just not physically fit? Is there anything else that you think we should understand about the goals for density transfer and how it could be useful on projects moving forward?
I think we should hear from Eric first because he's got a lot more experience with this. What's your thoughts on that, Eric, before I chime in?
It has come up where density transfer would be helpful to use with PUDs. I mean, it's kind of a base starting point. So, you're losing the density. On a PUD, you're gaining a little bit of a bonus in density, but not that much. You're mostly moving things around on site and you're doing more dense, less dense, and you're kind of coming up with your own development standards. So it depends on how the PUD code's written and how restrictive it is for additional density in different jurisdictions. And I think in Clark County, you don't get a ton more density, you get a little more density. So the density transfer, sometimes you end up better than a PUD. The other thing with PUD is there's limitations on size and it has to be a certain size project. That's another way to improve that is to reduce the size and increase the amount of density you can do in a PUD.
And I would add that a density transfer is codified much clearer so that when you use it, there's a certainty around it, which a developer likes. As I've said before, I don't like using a PUD because there's the interpretation that it has to be approved by the, I don't know what the terminology is, but it basically has to be approved at a hearing that our concept works. And so that's a risk that developers don't like to take. We want to know what the rules are. If we meet the rules, then we fall back to the rules and we say, no, we've met the rules. So that's why we prefer density transfer.
Yeah, I think that, as I said, it hasn't come up in our discussion to date, and in talking with county staff, we could do some further research, but sort of their initial impressions were that it hasn't been used on as many projects recently. So, again, before we get into a lot of the details, wanted to get a little better understanding about, is this a useful tool that merits revision, or is it just, are we on a more interesting and useful path with some of these other strategies? And this isn't going to be the primary tool.
I like the idea of a PUD because I like to be creative and, create stuff that has a better neighborhood feel, but I don't like taking a risk because time is money and, all the different stuff that goes on with being a developer. You spend a lot of money putting together ideas and plans with consultants, and I've spent 25 grand before I'm trying to push through a cottage development that at the end of it we just crumpled it up and put in the trash can. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, again, there's no proposal to make this go away. It was just the thought that if it's not being used very much, maybe it's just some minor revisions so that this keeps pace with the other changes we're proposing versus a more wholesale update. So
one of my notes was that in the density transfer, there's a transition, component. I think it's 90% along the boundary lines, and I would propose that you would go to 75%, so that since we're already going to have quite a drastic change possible on these infills and these compact lot stuff. So maybe you have a better transition or a faster transition lot by reducing that requirement for the edges.
yeah, great. I see right where that is. Noted. All right.
Elizabeth, you look like Ron's got his hand up.
Oh, great. Like I said, the way that this is displaying, I can't see all the hands. So please, thank you for that. And Ron,
Yeah.
please.
So just in talking about the density transfer, I think going back to Eric's earlier comments concerning what's going to fly and what's not going to fly, I'm all in favor of just like putting as many tools in the toolbox as possible. And then if they aren't appropriate, then you leave them in the toolbox for some other time. But if they're there and available and it helps penciling out a cottage housing opportunity or something like that, then yeah, absolutely. And you said you were going to talk about compact lots as a development strategy. So not familiar with what that's going to look like in comparison to just saying a PUD or cottage housing. It feels like, once again, if it's something that we think is going to merit investment, and there is an opportunity to grow some density on one portion of the project, then it feels like, why wouldn't we just go ahead and do it?
Yeah. So compact lots, that's the phrase that we're proposing for the compact subdivision, AKA the new version of the infill ordinance, where we're looking at similar increases in density as cottages, but with a different site layout component. So just an updated term as we've moved forward with the code. So yeah, and as far as the actual standards for the compact lot developments, the goal today is to get some of the base zone standards set, and then we can set the, what percentage of the underlying density, what percentage, how it relates to the minimum lot sizes. All that's coming in our next package of code at our next meeting. But thanks for your point. Agreed. Like more tools, more better, because a little more flexibility for different sites. All right. Let's get into some of these additional additional dimensional standards that are going to affect these R1 lots as being proposed. So I know that we've talked about the lot coverage at previous meetings. And so when we took a look at the existing lot coverages, the proposed minimum lot sizes, and sort of how those might add up and how we could use lot coverage sort of in balance to provide more housing options, provide more small, variety of sizes, make housing, more, I won't say more affordable, less expensive is my preferred term, right, with this project. And, somewhat in keeping with the intensity of existing development patterns in different neighborhoods. what we came back to you with is that some of these 50% lot coverages in, say, the R128, R110 zones, you know, even with modest lot size reductions, still allow for, you know, pretty large sized coverage footprints. That's the line at the bottom of the table here. We did take a look because we've heard the interest, particularly in the R1 7.5, R1 6, and R1 5 zones. So some modest increases are proposed there. But, you know, looking at the total coverage footprint, these still, you know, I don't develop things, I just write code. These seemed like reasonable numbers that are somewhat analogous to what is already permitted. And so we wanted to run this past you. Are these increases, are these pieces together providing, you know, appropriate coverage footprint, not appropriate, achievable coverages? Also keeping in mind, you know, if this isn't enough coverage, slightly larger lots can always be planned. It's just if there's a desire to take advantage of the lower lot sizes, then these coverage standards would apply. And then the other big piece that you'll see in as part of these proposals is sketched out what it would look like if we had that tiered system of lot coverage where there's increased lot coverage associated with additional units on each parcel. So curious to get your feedback about how this looks when you put it all together. So
I think the lot coverage has to be higher, otherwise it's going to prevent the density we're trying to achieve. If you're actually increasing the density, the lot coverage needs to go up as well.
what kind of coverage would be useful to achieve the density that,
Well, I almost think we need to look backwards. We need to take a look at what a typical lot size that we're trying to achieve, put the setbacks on there, and see what we're left with at the end. Because really, it's going to be controlled by setbacks, not lot coverage. There can be some other pieces to it, looking at what a reasonable, I mean, are we counting driveways for the lot coverage? If so, we need to look at some examples.
Yeah.
Pulling something out of the air, like, oh, this seems like a reasonable number, probably not the best way to do it. I think we need to look at examples.
Yeah, I've built on, 4,000 square foot lots with on the R15, when you have an average of 4,500, you can certainly, go down to 3,800 square foot pretty easy with, having some bigger lots and some smaller lots based upon what's going on, or having driveways be part of the lot. So I think that you need to be at 60%. What we found before was 55% was pretty tight. We did some stuff and we asked for variances and had to kind of nudge stuff around to be able to admit. So 60%, I would think, in the smaller ones, even for the detached R15, R16.
Yeah, Susan, can I call on you real quick? I don't see Richard here today. But I know we had this conversation about whether driveways count in the coverage, and it's structures that count toward the coverage. And I just can't remember if driveways are considered a structure.
I don't believe they are. I can answer that question. But what I was calling about with driveways, if you have like a flag lot where it's a shared driveway going back to it, and you have two flag lots, you can have a 4,500 square foot lot, but you end up with 3,600 square foot really buildable by the time you take out those driveway flags. So it can get really tight, even though the lot average works. So
All right.
And Elizabeth,
So,
my apologies, a little update. We do have Brian. Brian's been here, so they switched again. So Brian's going to be with us the next couple of
Well, I
meetings.
was wondering that.
I
Yeah.
know. When we changed the schedule, he was able to make these new dates. So he's here.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I was like, I thought we weren't getting Brian, but yeah, Brian, anything else you want to say about lot coverage since you're here?
No, I agree with, I think it was Dan and Eric have both said that the lot coverage has to go up with density. That's kind of a no duh, right? So smaller lot,
I
That's
mean,
all.
devil's advocate, it really depends on which objectives we're trying to fulfill, right? If we're trying to get the exact same homes that are currently being built on a smaller lot, yes, mathematically, it just has to go up. If the goal is you can still build the existing homes on the existing lot size, but there's now an option to build a smaller lot with a smaller home, then it doesn't necessarily have to go up. It's just about how, is that a feasible proposition? Does it meet our goals? How does that fit into the overall picture?
So, I mean, like townhomes have an increased lot coverage, I mean, the housing product, it probably changes that a little bit, but I don't know if single family detached is the best way to get increased density and less expensive housing, right?
Excellent terminology there.
I know one of the things that we do, even on our smaller houses, is that we're putting more and more covered patios,
Mhm.
which counts as structure. So, and those are so well received that we're actually making them bigger and bigger, because let's face it, summers around here are fantastic, but summers last from July 5th to August 31st. We don't get that great of long dry time. So
Great. Ron.
Yeah, I was looking at this and thinking to myself, the idea that, going into setting these up and making them our new code, we're not going to be shifting the product overnight, and we're going to need to, I think, allow for the structures. What we're really doing, though, is I think we're setting up the opportunity with smaller lots to have individuals make some choices about yard versus structure. And to Dan's point, if the covered patio is part of the structure, yet it gives them some of that outdoor feel, we're actually starting to make that blended choice in the marketplace already. So I am all for the idea of us continuing to be really downsized on what we're proposing for lots, but let the coverage go ahead and grow and make this kind of like the trade-off that we're looking at. Because I think at some point in time, whether it's the cost per square foot or even the entry-level housing price, we're going to want to get ourselves to the place that the market is going to say there's a demand for that lower cost entry level, and maybe that by itself shrinks the number of square feet on a smaller lot that we're starting from. So I think going with a larger initial footprint is okay. I mean, after all, isn't that, it's still called maximum, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just also, of course, the other issue around lot coverage that somehow I didn't put onto the slide here is making sure that we talk with development engineering about stormwater implications. So that's part of our additional follow-up work here. And I'm sure you all are far more aware of stormwater implications than I am. All right, any thoughts about the tiered lot coverage? Is that still of interest, or is there more sort of this idea, if we're looking at increasing it and letting people make some choices that, maybe it's a single standard and people make their choices from there? Is it a compelling incentive to get an extra 10% lot coverage to build a duplex or something?
Got to look at examples, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it kind of comes down to what are we, if we're incentivizing multifamily stuff, I would like duplexes or triplexes. I would actually go through and say, I prefer not to do that. I'm trying to figure out, how to ways to make them, as you pointed out, less expensive, so that we can actually get people into houses as the first step towards, financial security, ownership.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go through, I guess what I'm saying is I prefer not to incentivize multifamily in some way that we're writing up the code.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if there was any, sorry, if there was any way that we were going to be saying that, people buying duplexes would actually be living in one side and renting out the other, then it would kind of meet both criteria. But I think we really should be expecting right now that the duplexes or triplexes are going to be a product that's going to be put on the market for income generation. And the people that will be living in them probably will be in the renting class. So if
Right.
we
And
are
we're looking to support both renter and ownership opportunities.
right, but I guess what we
Really
haven't done,
one duplex, but across the neighborhood.
yeah, what we haven't done though is tried to weight one of those criteria against another, is my point.
Yeah. Okay. Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to also echo what I think you just said, Elizabeth, that we while we want to foster, wealth building and so forth, there's many people who can't afford to get into that market just yet, or they're at their stage in their life when they're not going to do it. And so I think I would not want us to fail to incentivize duplexes and other forms of middle housing. I think that needs to be part of the package as well. And I think partially that's driven by, I think, some of the things we're going to have to do with HB 1220 is going to make all of us jurisdictions have to provide significantly more small housing of various kinds at various income levels. And so without going on a tangent on that, we haven't really talked about that. And so I wondered if it would be possible for the next meeting just to get a 5-minute presentation from somebody from the county about that and what it's going to make us all do. We're at the City of Vancouver, we think it's going to be a significant change, but obviously we want to hear from a county perspective on that, because we are talking about the unincorporated VUGA. And it will have significant impact on how we, as just this group here, goes about its thinking, I think. And so I think we'd benefit by hearing a little bit about it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Brian. I've also been, tracking all the emails that come out from Commerce and, various articles about legislation being proposed. And, is this finally the year that Washington gets statewide middle housing, requirements? And it is both exciting and challenging to be doing this project in that context. But I like your proposal to get, just a little bit of background, not necessarily say, we can't do anything until we figure out what the legislation is, but the context could be really important. Just as a aside, we did do, it's just changing so fast. We did do a legislative analysis was part of our initial audit. And it just so happens that that was about 2 years ago and things have changed. Every session is new. So thanks. Jackie, you and I can talk about more like who at the county might be best on that. I'd like to know also. All right, you can see we're moving into medium density residential zones here based on the color coding. So I guess I'll just pause one more minute here if we have anything else on the low density zones that we haven't talked about so far that you would like to add. Okay, I sense enthusiasm to move to medium density zones. Great. So when we talk about the medium density residential zones, they are technically called, right, the very descriptive residential and office residential zones. And those implement the urban medium designation from the comp plan. It's funny, it's like the reverse of the low density where there's one designation, but two categories of zones. There's two designations, but only one category of zones in this section. Anyways, interesting structurally. We are not proposing any name changes. I'm calling it the medium density for our discussion, just as a descriptor, but it'll still be called the R12, R18, and R22 zones and the corresponding OR zones. So a lot of similar themes here that you'll see, that we are looking at expanding the range of uses here. So we're looking at permitting, well, first of all, sort of some of these administrative changes we talked about, like moving away from using the review approval category of uses and just permitting with the direct tie to the appropriate special use standards. Yeah, Brian, do you still have your hand up? No, you've got it done. Okay, got it. Duplexes, no changes there. The triplexes and quadplexes we're proposing to add as a use, although technically these are already permitted because multifamily is currently defined as 3 or more units, which is already permitted in these zones. But by pulling them out, and focusing in, we've discussed that, yeah, multifamily might be permitted, but no one would go through that process right now or try to apply the multifamily standards to do the 3 or 4 unit projects. So pulling those out. Townhouses, again, this is an administrative change to move to a permitted use subject to the same special use standards, those narrow lot standards in 4260 that we were talking about. Same change here, because cottage housing is already permitted, this compact lot development, right, which is our term for a different type of smaller scale, high density or, higher density product analogous to the cottage housing for the compact subdivision here. Again, bringing it in as a different use category and permitting it in the same zones. So along those lines, thinking about these zones, one question that I had was just thinking, do these cottage and compact lot developments and the additional density, are they as useful here in the medium density zones compared to the lower density R1 zones? Or are these of use here, or are there just enough other uses being proposed outright that these become less useful in these zones? Or any other changes to the use table that we just saw that you'd like to see? There we go.
I don't think they're that useful compared to the changes in the medium or in the low density.
Yeah.
You can already get the density you need for a cottage with a R12, 15, 18.
Okay. Great. Well, we will consider that. Yeah, it's just good to hear some verification of like, wait a second, are these really the right scale? All right, let's get into the lot area standards, right? Because this is what you can do by right, which might make those compact and cottage developments less necessary. So as we talked about a little with the low density zones, it's the minimum lot area and the maximum density that are going to work together to control the intensity of development in these zones. And the way these work in these zones is a little bit different than the R1 zones. It would be nice in some ways if it were a little more uniform, but that's not sort of what we're starting with. So just to think about the lot area standards, we're not proposing any changes to the single family detached, which are already, fairly small. Single family, to jump to the bottom, the townhouses, only one change proposed to those townhouses in the R12. The duplexes, I guess the duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes are all proposed. Here it didn't make sense to make them equal to the single family detached because it just, I don't know that you can really get a duplex on an 1,800 square foot lot. But instead, so they're proposed as just a multiple of the townhouse lots, because that just seemed scale wise what would be feasible. But the important consideration is that despite this gradation of lot sizes in different zones and sort of the ability to choose your own adventure there, all of the zones are proposed to have a maximum density of 22 units per acre. So that's going to be more of a controlling factor in some zones than others. It means, like, for example, in the R22, not all of these lot sizes could be achieved on certain scales. And so there's sort of that balance there that I'm not entirely comfortable. Yeah, not entirely sure if that's where we want to land on that. When we start thinking about this density piece that complements those lot sizes, no changes to the minimums in these zones. The proposal, as you saw, was to increase the density in the zones where we could, but I was trying to keep it below 22 units per acre to stay within the urban medium comprehensive plan policies. Right, but that means that by the time you get to RM20, well, it means a couple of things, but by the time you get to RM22, there's not really any, or that should just say R22, there's not really room to further increase the density right now. And it sort of could have a flattening effect. The lot sizes provide some gradation in scale, but not a whole lot. It makes the differences between these zones, less intense. And then here is where we have the opportunity to talk about, the way that gross and net acres are measured for the purposes of density, and how the current methodology has disparate impacts on individually platted units, so those townhouses and single family detached compared to multifamily. So one of the goals of proposing the overall density increase along with those minimum lot sizes, particularly in the the R12 and the R18, is that it takes a little bit of pressure off of the existing limits by bumping those limits up. And so maybe this density measurement becomes less of a concern if there's just more room to work with. But I really struggled here with thinking about sort of two different goals of, well, could we measure density in gross acres and net acres more uniformly across the code? That's something that we've talked about with county staff. But it seems like the issue for these medium density zones is that it's precisely having a uniform standard that is resulting in these disparate impacts. And so to try to address those disparate impacts and how, drive aisles on multifamily are treated differently than dedicated right-of-way on a similar intensity project on individual lots, it would really take the opposite of a uniform standard to address that. And so struggling with, just trying to balance that tension and thinking about some pros and cons. And then a last note before we try to dive into this ball of wax is just that if you look through the code, you'll see there's no changes proposed to the multifamily densities with this round of updates. So they stay at 12, 15, or 12, 18, and 22. And that creates somewhat of a temporary mismatch. And we'll discuss that in the second round of updates, because one of the concepts is also density increases for multifamily across the medium and high density zones. So there's a lot there, and questions for you all about how these lot area and density can work together, and if we're achieving some goals that we set out to. So first one is just, is there any interest to allow lot size averaging in these zones similar to the R1 zones? Or, the lot sizes are already pretty small. Does it not add a lot of value? And what are your reactions to this idea of going to 22 units per acre across all three of these zones and not changing the methodology? Is that increase enough to address the issues that are coming up, or are there further changes to the methodology? And then also maybe just pulling back a little and saying, like, is it that we really want to have entirely equal opportunities for a multifamily duplex, townhouse, et cetera? Or is it just that we need to have enough density for each dwelling type, however that lines up, that's appropriate to the scale of those dwellings? So I'll turn it over to the group for some reactions.
I think we already said it, but we talked about the less right of way or private road easements or other things like that too.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to tease out here is there a single consistent change? Is it just about including private roads in that deduction? Or is it really a request that, you know, say on a multifamily, that some percentage of the drive aisles also be, that's not probably the right way to do it, but is the problem that the right of way gets deducted, but not the drive aisle? Or is it just that? Yeah.
That's the issue, Elizabeth.
Okay, yeah.
If the way that the calculation is right now is that you're the subtracting out proposed right of ways that are that are going to be part of a platted subdivision, where if you propose a apartment, then there is no deduction. So it's different between the two of them, and it's only when you're doing the density calculation for the maximum, because the minimum, you have the ability to go through and say, I'm proposing, to meet the minimum is, and you could subtract out all right of ways and all that stuff. So just to be clear, to make it to where, if you're looking at max, just make it to where it's the gross site area minus the existing right of ways. And then the area question, I don't believe I don't have any interest in trying to do lot size averaging in these small lots. So
Yeah, fair. I mean,
it's already compact enough.
okay, thanks. I just wanted to hear some feedback that it didn't seem like a useful add, but since it was on the table, I love it when the code book is open. Eric, were you ready to jump in with something?
No.
Oh. Yeah, I guess I'm just still wrestling with this density, and I understand the issue and how it has disparate impacts. But I'm also not sure, like, how would we measure the area of drive aisle and define that in order to subtract it out? Just because it's not necessarily as clear cut on a multifamily project as it is when you have actual right of way. So yeah, and I guess, maybe just to turn it back, like, if we just increase the density, does that solve the problem? Or does there still need to be a change to the methodology?
I don't know. I think you apply private roads the same as public roads, because internal public roads are subtracted out, internal private roads are not, and drive aisles and things like that.
Well, I mean, there's private roads and then there's drive aisles, right? And like parking areas for multifamily.
Right.
Just that those are not a defined term, the same way like private roads are going to have a tract and boundaries, and you can calculate the area, and that's an easy switch to make. I think it's more we have car circulation patterns on a multifamily site that are not currently defined. They're not carved out, and so it's just trickier to think about how we would subtract those.
Again, I think we need to look at some examples and what the ramifications are. And I think that's kind of, just talking about it, it sounds fine, but I know it's come up as an issue.
Yeah, and I like the R12 and R18, especially the R12. I mean, there's really not that much of it in the county, but I think that the community planning was more have it as a transition piece between say a school or a park and single family detached, or what we're calling low density.
Yeah.
Now, so a little concerned that having everything having at 22 units per max acre or 22 units per acre it strips away some of that planning that the county's already done to have some kind of transition. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, Elizabeth. I'm sorry about that, but
It's useful input. Thank you. Ron.
Yeah, so I'm going to propose maybe a little bit of homework in regard to actually seeing how useful this is with our current GIS system. What if you take a couple of places in this urban growth area that we're already studying, include some high density in Hazeldale and then some high density out in, I don't know, Pleasant Valley or something, and start looking at the idea of whether it's looking the same or whether we're finding that they're giving us different numbers from what we would expect to be seeing out there. I mean, just in the context of, say, if you go all the way back to the most simplistic nature of just saying gross area and how many dwellings have fallen on that piece of land, is that good enough for what we're trying to get to for the county? I don't honestly know that, but I do know if the workload becomes really complex, people end up taking shortcuts or it doesn't get done. And I think for what we're really trying to do, having targets that are measurable for the future are probably our biggest opportunity for getting it right in the future.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see what we can do. Yeah, we might be calling on some of you before our next meeting for some project examples where we could maybe do some of this homework. All right, let's talk about some of the some other lot development standards proposed for the MDR or medium density, let's call it. So in terms of lot coverage here, here we are proposing a slightly different approach in these zones. And so careful table readers might see here that essentially what I've done is proposed, if a certain lot coverage is proposed for townhouses, then it should probably be allowed for all the other dwelling types, given the way that those lot sizes are configured pretty similarly under the proposal. So that's sort of the secret formula behind that proposal. So I guess before we do that, well, it's not working right. Any questions about lot coverage or other dimensional standards in these medium density zones before we talk about parking?
yeah, I think that you need to reduce the lot dimensions. I didn't see that in the table. I think that, like I said, I can build a detached house on a 28-foot lot, probably even 26 if you have 4 foot, 4 foot per or 8 foot between buildings. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can take a look at that. Okay, well, let's do parking. Yeah, so as we talk about bringing lot sizes down, as we talk about increasing densities and getting more units on more lots, right? There's just only so much space on these lots we're proposing. And so the trade-offs that between parking space and house space need to, come under consideration. Gosh, that shouldn't say R12. That's my apologies. Little copy paste error there. That should just be for all zones. What we're proposing are some reductions to the parking minimums. So the standard for single family detached stays exactly the same as 2 units. Duplexes and triplexes are proposed to go down from 2 spaces to 1 space. So that means you're either looking at a total of 2 or a total of 3 on a lot, which seems a lot more feasible than, trying to fit 6 different spaces in on, say, a triplex lot. Again, these are minimums. Certainly if there are proposals to use driveway and garage space that provide more parking, absolutely can be part of an individual site. But, here we're trying to set the minimums. Quadplexes right now would fall under multifamily. And so right now they have a 1.5 space requirement, proposing also to use that 1 space per unit for those. The townhouses right now have like an incremental space, right? They have this 2.5 spaces with the idea that it can be met, well, not just the idea, but with the standards that it can be met through a combination of off-street parking as well as some shared on-street or off-street parking areas. And so the proposal there is to make it a flat 2 spaces. And then cottage dwellings, likewise, I didn't put it in the draft table, but I saw it. We should probably add it here. Right now it's also that 1.5 space, and I believe it's a similar concept that it's 1 space for the dwelling as a minimum, but then some extra that's sort of shared. So idea to look at a minimum of 1 space there, always room for more if an individual development proposes it. And accessory dwellings right now are a 1 space, except that it can be met either off street or on street. And most places do have on street. So it's not entirely clear, it's not entirely accurate to say that ADUs require a 1 off street parking space right now. But consideration based on some best practices is to make that minimum a straight 0 for all ADUs, and then whatever works on the lot, whether it's on space or off street, on street, other combinations would be up to the individual property owner, and it would just be a little bit clearer to administer. This is always a good topic for discussion. So a few points that I came up with, and I'm looking forward to your feedback as well. Of course, your reactions on some of these specific parking standards. And then also, some feedback. What am I getting wrong about these fractional spaces? Or is there something that I didn't consider? How are they working? Is it correct, for lack of a better word, that these fractional spaces are intended for, my favorite term, party parking? I came across in some of the literature. Is that really what they're trying to do? Or is there a different goal that I'm missing? Is this fractional space thing working? Maybe, should we continue to require these fractional spaces? Are we wrong to take them away? Or could these objectives to have on and off-street parking be served better? Maybe there are separate on and off-street requirements rather than just one single combined standard. Or maybe it's just adjusting the driveway spacing and the street types and street widths so that there's some guarantee that there actually is on-street parking without having to set, a per unit requirement. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that. And also just, we talked about this at the concept level, whether to propose these overall reductions or whether it's more about site-specific reductions. So maybe that's projects that are, smaller, below a certain square footage, meet regulated affordable targets, which we'll get into some more in our second package of code. Lots served by transit is right now in Washington state legislation, like a really popular way to define lots that should be exempt from parking. We could use that. We've talked some about how that works in Clark County. It's not the most useful metric in my opinion. And then I was just thinking there's one other we left off this list. Or on-street parking is another way to inform the site-specific reductions. So any thoughts about bringing some of those in either to complement these proposals or in place of these reductions?
So I'll go ahead and start. I'm a dinosaur when it comes to parking. I'm not, I'm not willing to vote yes on removing parking. People are still gonna drive. It rains here, right?
Mm.
People are still gonna drive. And if you take away the parking, they're just gonna park on all the existing developments that are surrounding the one where you took away the parking. I get it that parking takes up valuable land space. I do, but I just think that the overflow or the effect that it has on surrounding developments is poor. So
Mhm.
I am not in any way advocating air pollution, but I just see you can't get rid of cars, man. You just can't.
There's multiple dimensions, right? Personal behavior is not something we get to regulate in zoning code.
I would agree with Brian. I mean, we see in our townhouse developments and everything we do, I mean, we fight to put as much parking in there as possible. I mean, we've tried to make there where there's shared driveways next to each other, flip houses back, flip townhouses back and forth if possible, so that there's actually can have some some parking in a townhouse development on the street, which is very difficult to do. So
Yeah.
I'm a little apprehensive about saying if we go down to 1 or 0. And you were asked about the the fractional
Mhm.
parking. That's exactly for that. We've trying stuff, like I said, parking in places to where somebody that's a guest can show up and park near where they are trying to visit. Because a lot of these townhouses, especially, people use the garage, at least half of it, for storage. And so it's not unusual to see 2 cars parked out in front of a garage, and the garage used for storage of, everybody's got toys, and Christmas, paraphernalia they're putting on their houses and all the other stuff that goes on with it. So they add just the story. So I would look for like maybe 1.5 per unit, with everything.
Yeah, and just thinking about the balance, right? What is, another issue that comes up around this a lot is like, what is the government's role in terms of regulating parking versus the private market, right? Because we have to set parking minimums. So, one sort of devil's advocate response that I could have is, oh, you're going to look to put parking anywhere you can fit it in. So that's great. That's the private market at work to provide the parking that's going to serve the development. And therefore the minimums can be set, not independent from those considerations, but we're not, is it the goal of a parking code to exactly equal what a developer might want to put in at a maximum, or is it to set like a true minimum that can then be exceeded?
My concern would be exactly what Brian brought up, is that when you have a minimum and somebody actually achieves a minimum,
Mhm.
that you end up an overflow into the neighborhood, and you end up having the county's got to deal with a very distraught, neighborhood saying this is going to happen, and it does. And then there's this whole negative thing. I understand we're trying to get some more affordability. I think that if you had some kind of, if you're within, I don't know, 1,000 feet of a transit line, that you could have 0 parking, or half a unit per half a parking space per unit,
Mhm.
so that you can have that mass transit available that people could actually use.
Yeah, gotcha. Right. This is one of our last topics for today, and we've got about 30 minutes. So feel free to, other voices out there, happy to hear from you all, and also happy to wrap up if we've covered it.
I think, Elizabeth, you've mentioned a few times you can't see people's hands raised, but Brian Snodgrass and Ron Barca both have their hands raised.
Yeah, sorry, just the way that I'm doing
Yep, no worries. I'm just letting you know.
Perfect. Ron, go ahead.
So I guess I would like to voice the thought process of, ensuring that we understand that these are minimums, which makes it the developer's choice. If it's the difference between being able to pencil out a project or not, with available land or impervious surfaces becoming an issue from stormwater, and they want to be able to reduce down, this is slim, but I think acceptable in the direction that a lot of trends are going. We're not saying that anybody has to hit the minimum. We're saying that we want at least this much. I think the idea of people being able to just say, well, I did the minimum. Well, that's indeed what just took place. And then that is the developer's choice. I think we're going to have to show some movement in this direction, because I believe the trends are going this way, either at the state legislation or in a broader context of how to regain available land for the use of smaller projects. So I'm not opposed to the aspect of minimums, as long as we make it bold and large and make sure everybody clearly understands that that's what it is. This is the bottom threshold, not the only available number.
Great, thanks, Ron. Brian? Oh, you're still unmuted.
I would certainly agree with that. It's important to, these are minimums. And I think developers, and obviously I'm not one, but have some incentive to provide parking sufficient to the market they're aiming at. And so, and for that matter, buyers have some incentive to buy into a development that meets their perceived parking needs. So that's not to say there aren't going to be problems, but I think there's several safeguards to avoid sort of the catastrophic situation where parking completely goes to hell in a handbasket. We adopted many of these minimums last year, many of which were in response to state mandates, and didn't receive that much opposition. It's early to draw a firm conclusion from that, but nonetheless didn't receive much opposition at the time. Haven't heard many complaints since. So at least the early findings are good, that the floodwaters haven't opened on some of these. And so it's also the case that we're talking about code changes that would at best be implemented on the undeveloped land or some of the redeveloped land. So there still will be ample supplies of land and developments in the VUGA for those folks who want a lot of parking. It'll be there for them. So I think we should be aggressive on these standards applying to the newer developments, which are only going to form sort of a portion of the total.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other hands right now. Ron, I assume you are done.
Yeah, I'll get it off.
No problem. We're all still learning Zoom.
I'm curious about the developments from Mr. Snodgrass. Were some of the projects that were adopted, did they provide the bare minimum parking, or did they provide more than the minimums? I mean, I think that's encouraging that you haven't had a loud opposition yet. That's encouraging, right? I'm just wondering what type of neighborhoods these were in. I mean, if it was inner city Vancouver, or maybe even downtown. I mean, Clark County doesn't really have areas like that, right? And so there may be the need for a little more parking in some of the outer county unincorporated areas, as opposed to places along the Mill Plain corridor or downtown, right? I mean, they're just certain dynamics that are different.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know. We haven't done like a formal audit since adoption of our standards. The impression I get, I mean, and I'm only sort of aware of some of the developments coming in, but the impression I get from development review planners who review all of this stuff is that in many cases, developers do choose to provide more or a little bit more at least. There seems to be a trend moving away from that. There seem to be some developers I hear who really want to take advantage of the new lower parking standards and others who, so it sounds like it's a situation in flux.
Thanks. That's interesting.
I'd say very rarely do we go with the minimums anyway. A lot of, most developers want to provide some parking if they can. Homes don't sell without parking. But sometimes there are some areas that aren't counted, like if there is a lot of on-street parking, it takes a little pressure off the on-site stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is the point at which I'd love to turn it over to the group as we're sort of wrapping up our discussion for today, setting some direction that's going to inform the second batch. But anything else that we didn't get a chance to discuss, reactions to the draft language that you'd like the group to consider?
Yeah, I have a couple of notes. One of them is in the ADUs, if you have a detached ADU, it's limited to 18 feet in height. And I think that that height should be increased up to I don't know if 35 feet's correct, but I mean, it should be at least 25 feet. So you can do a 2-story because you can have a garage underneath and an ADU on top. I've had some buddies that have built those in the city of Vancouver and they're well received. So 18 feet's a little too tight.
Yeah.
It's a lot too tight.
Yeah.
And then as we're going through these new changes, I'd like to see something in the code. In the multifamily code, it says that if there's any kind of discrepancy between the two codes, that the most restrictive is supposed to be adapted. And I think that in the light of what we're trying to accomplish, there needs to be something in the code that says, if there is some kind of discrepancy between two, the staff is directed to take the most accommodative interpretation of the code so that we can, there's going to be a lot of workarounds and a lot of conflicts that come up with these big changes. So just having that in the code and have the council aware of that so that as we work through it, we're trying to be as flexible as possible.
Dan, I'm pretty sure you probably already know this, but I didn't know this initially when I started at the county. We don't measure height to the ridge of the roof.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. It's the center line.
It seems a weird way to measure height to me. I just wanted to make sure. I figured you already knew that stuff.
Yeah, but at 18 foot, if you put a garage, Brian, and you put a garage.
No, I get it. I understand your point. You're right. I think 18 foot isn't nearly enough to do that.
No.
And I have seen a couple of those ADUs in the city of Vancouver, and they look just fine as far as an accessory dwelling unit next to the house.
Yeah, I think they're great. So.
I had in my notes, I think Daniel was talking early in this discussion, and there was some discussion about the widths, minimum widths or lot widths versus the aspect of just shrinking the overall square footage. And I had thought we were going to come back to that in some fashion. Is that next time that we're doing that? Because I'm a little concerned that we're still working with the averages and minimums in different places, when I think part of the discussion was going to be about the idea of the structures kind of dictating what we were going to get in the way of coverage in an average square footage of a lot, but not necessarily going with those minimums any longer. So maybe I got that wrong.
Couple pieces. Yes, we did have a pin to come back and maybe talk about some of these lot dimension standards. I'm not sure I completely follow the idea that we're going to move away from the lot dimensions and move towards some other standards, but maybe there's some more clarification there or nuance that I missed.
My comment was just overall, if you're reducing the size of the lot, that and especially with average, that to add more flexibility instead of having, I think it's right now it's 80-foot minimum width on a R175. I mean, if you went down to 65, that's still plenty of wide. So and just that whole reduce them appropriately. If you've reduced stuff by 20%, maybe you ought to look at, instead of having 50 foot, go down to 40. If it's 40, go down to 32. And the depth the same. So the minimums, because especially when you do infill, to be able to be flexible and creative can really have some benefit.
Yeah, right. We will take a look at that. And I also remembered, maybe Ron, this was part of what you're remembering as we were talking about looking at the setbacks and how those influence lot coverage. And I recalled, since those earlier comments, Eric, that you made, we did do some initial analysis of that with the code audit a couple of years ago. So I will go back to those and see if they can help us inform our discussion, and if there's if they need to be further updated or some other case studies that might inform our discussion about the lot coverages for next time.
I agree with what Daniel just said on the widths, and most of the discussion today. I think this is going in a good direction. The one standard that wasn't talked about, that if I had to change one thing or suggest a change on one thing that wasn't talked about today, it was in the R15 zone. Going right now, I think the proposal on the table is to go to 4,500 minimum average. Is that right?
Yes.
I'd say let's go down to 4,000 on that. I know some of the rationale for not moving too far on those jumps is not wanting to crowd into the next lowest or highest zone, and there isn't one lower than R15 in terms of the base zones. And that's also, when we're talking about lots that big, that's where you can make I think a big jump in potentially, if they get built, in more lower cost housing. So I think that's some lower hanging fruit that won't that's going to be a little bit more palatable, and I'd encourage us to do that.
And to clarify, I think what you're saying, Brian, is to go down to a 4,000 square foot minimum or a 4,000 square foot average. Average. Okay. Yeah. Because you can go down to 3,400 easy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I see right where that is in the draft, so we can take a look at that.
And I would certainly agree. I mean, we built on infill in the city of Vancouver on 4,000 square foot lots, and they're fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but probably moving to 4,000 in the R15 is going to have a lot more impact than changing the 20,000 square foot in R120. Great. Well, as you're sort of pondering your any remaining notes that you have, just to remind you, you can always email me in between meetings, or probably email Jackie directly, and then she will make so that it's on the project record, and then she can be sure to forward to me.
I had a question for you, Elizabeth. In your write-up, you had a code, you had notations for some code that I assume is going to be proposed, like 40.260.072, which doesn't exist, and 225. So
Correct.
Is that already written, or is that some way that we can get that to review it? I guess when are we going to see that?
Yeah, perfect. Great transition. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so that moves us right into our next step. So we'll be looking at forum meeting number 4 coming up on February 22nd. And that's when those code sections are going to be ready for review in advance of those meetings. So, wanted to use today to get these base standards, and then that'll help inform where we go with those sections, including those new sections. For those ones you referenced are going to be the new standards for the compact lot development and the triplexes and quadplexes. Some revisions to the existing ones. So that's where we can take care of, many of the concepts we've discussed, but then some other pieces that got raised today about things like the ADU size relative to the main house and the ADU height. So we'll be taking a look at all those, and then stay tuned also. Jackie and I and the project team are working on getting that public open house scheduled. So when we get that onto the calendar, we will pass it to you. Would love your help getting it out to your networks. Once we have a time for that, we'll have, code background for folks to review, but, this is really our more detailed code nitty-gritty group, right? That's why we've brought you together in this forum. So we'll be sharing some of it and have it available at the open house if people have feedback, but we'll be taking it a little bit more conceptually, just in the interests of trying to cover it all and meet a broader audience there. So that's about what you can expect. Jackie, and I'll hand it over to you. If you have any concluding thoughts or words of wisdom for us.
No, I just wanted to again thank everyone that's participating. And for those people that are listening as attendees, keep checking in on the webpage and make sure if you haven't already signed up for project updates, so you get notifications on the upcoming meetings and that open house. And if you have questions or comments, like we mentioned earlier, feel free to reach out to me. My contact info is on the project page, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. All right. Well, I think that was a great meeting. Thanks all, and have a great evening. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for the productive discussion and comments.
Hey, Jackie,
Yeah.
I was going to be silent, but I might as well just expose my ignorance. There was a discussion about a House bill coming
Yes.
up. I have no idea what you're talking about. So can you let me know what that's about?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. I'll
Besides-
send you some info to get you started. And it looks like maybe we'll do a little bit of information on it at the February meeting as well.
Awesome.
Okay. All right.
Cool. Adios, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.